Hi, I'm Kirsten Lovett. I'm co-chair of the North Andover Parent Advisory Council, or NAPAC. We are the organization in town that works with families who have students on IEP or 504 plans. We are very excited today to bring you a webinar presentation on applying to college. As a parent of a sophomore, we are just about there, and I'm very excited to be able to have Janet Tebow here with us today. Janet is a college counselor and has been working with students for 15 or so years on applying to colleges and making decisions for how they want to proceed with their educational careers. So without further ado, we're going to start, and we're going to have lots of questions, and we're very excited for you to get this information.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My name's Janet Tebow. I'm the principal at BTA Education. I work with families and students K-12 as an advocate and as a college consultant for children and students and families getting ready for college. So today we're going to spend some time talking about how to find the right college for students with special needs. We can move on to the next slide. So in general, the college process goes something like this. You do your research, you choose the schools, you apply to schools, you select the school that you're going to attend, you request accommodations if you have some special needs, and you go there and have a great time and you thrive, you graduate, and life's hunky-dory. That sounds simple, right? In fact, it's a little more challenging when you have a student with special needs. You want to make sure that they go to the right school, that the school has the right supports for them, that their needs are going to be met both academically and socially, and also that they are learning in a way that lets them thrive. So we're going to spend some time today talking about really what goes into this process for students with special needs. And we can move on to the next slide. These are the topics we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about whether or not you need some updated testing, high school versus college, what's different, ways to get your student the help they need to get ready for college, and really having a conversation about the supports that a student needs in college, because everything's so very different from high school to college. Some specific application considerations when they're ready to start completing the application, and some suggestions for transitioning successfully. I have some friends with me that are going to be asking some questions throughout. If at any point while you're listening to this you have questions, my contact information is available at the end of the workshop, so feel free to reach out to me directly as well. So let's get started. So the first question is, what's different between high school and college? And the simple answer is everything is different. And we're going to spend some time really looking at this both from a basic function standpoint, but also really drill down into what's different for the student. So let's get going. In high school, the school is required to educate your student. Until they graduate, they're responsible for teaching your student. They're not supposed to let your child fail. If your child has special needs, they're supposed to find them. If your child is receiving a special education, they're on an IEP. Some students are on 504 plans. In school every day, everyone's on pretty much the same schedule. They arrive at the same time, they stay through the day, classes change at the same time, and they all go home at the same time, more or less, depending on what they're doing after school. Flip that to college, and you'll see that everything changes. Colleges are not required to educate your student. Your student has to be able to meet the demands of the college entry and also the demands of the classes that they're taking. Colleges don't offer specialized instruction. There are no IEPs in college. Colleges do offer accommodations, but we're going to talk about some of the differences even between a 504 plan in high school and accommodations in college. So colleges are required to provide those accommodations, but they're only designed to level the playing field. They're not designed to get your child any added advantages in their classes. So they may give your child access to a note taker or extra time on tests, but they're not going to actually change the content for any of those classes. Some colleges do offer programs that are more comprehensive for students with specific special needs, and we'll be talking about those in a little while. But the other big change is that the entire day is flexible. The classes that your student takes is flexible. So they need to have the ability to make those choices in an informed way. And we can move on to look at the next slide. The other big thing that changes is all of the responsibilities change. When your student's in K-12, you as the parent and the school are the main decision makers for what they're receiving for services, what they're getting for accommodations, and really how they're planning their courses and how they're spending their time and what goals they're working on. Everything shifts to being the student's responsibility in college. And so that student needs to be prepared to manage that shift effectively. And we're going to be spending some time talking about this in a little while as well. But we can move on to the next slide. So for the student, we've sort of talked about this whole shift in responsibility, but also when you look at their days, we have to consider what changes for them as well. So let's spend some time going through each of these. And there's going to be a slide for each of them so we can see some of the differences. And you'll be getting a handout for each of these slides, so you don't need to take notes while we're going through this. So we can move on to the next slide about classes. In high school, a student's told what they have to do to get a good grade in a class, what their assignments are, and when they're due. In college, it's up to the student to understand the materials, lectures and assignments and deadlines. No teacher is going to say, remember, on Friday we have a quiz, in 3 months we have a paper due. So it's really important for the student to be able to manage their time and understand those assignments and deadlines well in advance of when they're actually due. So as we're thinking about classes and how they change for a student, it's important to consider how does your student manage their free time and how do they manage their assignments. And if they're doing this well now, that's wonderful and a good indicator that they're ready to do it in college. If they're not doing this and it's very much, mom or dad or relative or friend driven, we're going to need to spend some time in high school getting them the skills they need to be able to manage their time and decision making better. And we can move on to the next topic. Tests in college and high school are also very different. In high school, mastery is defined as the ability to reproduce what's been taught to the student and do problems that are similar to what they've covered in school already. In college, that really does change. In college, mastery is the ability to apply what they've learned to a new or novel sort of situation. So it's really asking them to study something, think about it, synthesize it, and then respond to a question that is new and something that they haven't talked about in class before. So when we start thinking about a student with special needs going on to college, we really need to start thinking about how are they at not only learning to do well on a test, but really learning to acquire that knowledge and doing something new with it. And we can move on to talking about teachers versus professors. In high school, the teacher's job is to educate. So if you think about, the role of a teacher and a student, half of the responsibility is on the teacher to make sure that the student gets what's being presented. And half of it's on the student to make sure that they're doing their homework, doing their studying, meeting with the teacher if they have questions. In college, that whole notion of what the role of a professor is shifts. The role of a professor is not to teach. It's not on them for your student to get the material or not. Their role is to really present the information, and then it's up to the student to learn. So that's a really big difference as well. And again, as we think about a student with special needs, we want to be mindful of how are they at owning all of that learning process while they're in high school, and how are they going to do that in college effectively. And we can move on to the next slide. In high school, a lot of times, teachers will grade for effort. So if a student's really trying and doing all of the work, most teachers are willing to give them the benefit of the doubt and bump up a grade or give them extra credit or, be very generous in their grading. Not so much in college. Grades are not based on effort, they're based on results. So if your student has a hard time testing well, if your student has a hard time managing their assignments and passing them in on time, all of those things are going to be reflected in their grade much more harshly than they would be usually in a high school setting. The one important thing to think about for college as you look at your student, what their abilities are, is really How do they do managing a relationship with a teacher? How do they manage their workload? And are they able to self-advocate and ask for help when they need to, not the night before a test, but actually throughout the semester, to really make a relationship with a professor so that they can get the help that they need? We can move on and talk about the next topic. There are a lot of rules in high school, and for students who need structure, those rules are really helpful because they help the student conform to the set expectations. They show up at a certain time, they leave at a certain time, they do the work it's due this day, and it's very predictable. That really changes in college as well, so that students are no longer set in a set schedule. A lot of the decision making and flexibility gives them new options and new choices, and for some students that can be really daunting. They're not in school from 7:30 to 2:30 every day. They may have a class or 2 or 3 Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and 2 separate classes on Tuesday, Thursday, and all of that extra free time should be spent studying, but if nobody's sitting there telling the student that they should be studying, they may not. So as you look at your high school student, it's really important to be mindful of how they use their free time, how they work out and manage their time, and what they're doing when they're in unstructured time, and how they're able to respond to that. So before we get into the next topic about helping your student get ready for college, I just want to see if any of my friends have questions or anything that I can clarify. You're all set? Okay, we're going to keep going then. So as you start to think about getting your student ready for college, I think the first question is your student ready for college? Because there's, and we were talking about this before, there's a lot of pressure and expectations that everybody goes on to college. And for a lot of students with special needs, that either may not be the next logical step, or it may not be the thing that they really want to do next. So we're going to assume for the purposes of the rest of this presentation that they are ready for college, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on. But as parents, it's really important for you to have those sorts of conversations with your student and to be honest with them and yourself about whether or not this is the next best step for them. But assuming it is, we're going to talk about some suggestions for what to do to help your student get ready. How many of you have, so these are some of the considerations to think about as you think about college readiness. How are your students' grades? What sort of courses are they taking and how are they doing? What are their interests? Are they ready for 4 more years of school? What sort of level of independence do they have? For some students with special needs, you know, their executive functioning is horrible. For others, it's wonderful. For some students, you know, self-care needs are a real concern, and for others, it's not at all. So just looking at their readiness, can they do their own laundry? Can they make their own choices? Can they self-advocate? All those things are going to be really important. What's their motivation? If you're the one who's making sure that all their homework is done and all their assignments are done and they're doing well in their classes, are they really motivated to go into a college setting where all the demands are going to be on them and still be able to succeed and thrive in that sort of setting? So again, we're going to assume that the answer is yes, and we're going to move on to talking about how your student understands their disability. How many of you have given your students access to their testing reports and their IEP and really walk them through those so that they understand what their strengths and challenges are, what their diagnosis is, and what their goals are that they're currently working on? I think when kids are in elementary and middle school, the natural inclination is, as a mom or dad or a parent or caregiver, is to really make all of those decisions without the student, because it's a lot of information for them to understand. But by the time they're in high school, they really need to be understanding and being able to access their testing and their IEPs and their 504 plans to know what's included and hopefully give them input into those. So if you haven't done so yet, spend a weekend, give them the reports, have them go through them, sit down and explain them to them, but really make sure that they understand what's in those documents. Help them understand their diagnosis, help them understand how they learn and what their needs are, but even more importantly, help them understand where their vulnerabilities or challenges are, because they're not going to be good at going off to college and thriving if they don't know where those potential roadblocks or pitfalls are. So we want to make them as prepared as possible to really understand and be able to explain their disability, both so that it makes sense to them, but also so that they can talk to the disability services staff to explain why they need accommodations. And we can move on to the next slide. We talked a little bit about self-advocacy, and you start to see as all of those changes from high school and college come into play how important it is for a student to really be able to articulate their needs and also find the right people to ask for help. So I'm going to give you a scenario. I had a student who was in a wheelchair and went to a great college in Boston. They were not from the area. And they had a professor who had office hours, but their office was in the basement of a building that was very old and wasn't wheelchair accessible. She was in a wheelchair. So she had gone to school early to learn all the curb cuts and how to navigate around the campus in her wheelchair. And interestingly enough, at the same time over the summer, the football team was on campus. So the student reached out to some of her friends on the football team, and she said, I have an appointment with a professor who's in the basement office and I can't get there. Can you help me? And 7 of the big, strong, burly football players showed up to get her wheelchair into the basement office and then stood outside the door so that the professor knew how completely inappropriate it was for him not to be more accommodating to her needs. And then when she was done with the meeting, got her back up and out. So really knowing who to go to and how to ask for help is really an important part. And it's not just setting relationships with professors, but it's finding those people on campus who are going to help you get what you need. So self-advocacy is a really important skill that should be done and worked on and developed, if not before high school, certainly during high school. And these are all things that you can have conversations with the team about if you're in an IEP meeting or working with your accommodations on the 504 plan, to really look at this as part of your students' transition, is developing those self-advocacy skills while they're in high school so that they're well set and established and good at it by the time they go on to college. And we can move on to the next slide. The other thing that needs to change isn't just things that your student needs to develop and get better at. It's things that you as a parent might need to shift. And I think when we talk to parents of students with special needs, there's been so much advocacy, there's been so much work, there's been so much effort put into getting your student the services that they need. It's sometimes really scary to think that you're going to be paring back that work and giving that responsibility to your student. But that's really important for your student to be able to be successful when they go off to college. So while they're still in high school, give them some of the decision-making abilities that you've been doing for a long time. Involve them in the decision-making around their education, but also around something as simple as, do you want Chinese or Italian for takeout this evening? Something as complicated as, where are we going to go on our vacation? Give them every opportunity to make decisions for themselves, both big and small. Help them build their own executive functioning skills. For a lot of parents, you're sort of your child's prefrontal cortex, and you're the control center of all the things that they're trying to get done. And it's really important during high school to shift that responsibility to help them develop those executive functioning skills so that they can go off and apply them effectively in college. If you have a high school student, they need to be doing their own laundry. They need to be cooking their own meals, and they need to be cleaning their own room. Their roommate is not going to do any of those things for them, so truly you're doing your student and their new roommate a great service if you help them get ready to be able to do those basic independent skills on their own. We've already talked about the self-advocacy skills, so we can move on to the next slide. Before we move on to the updated testing, any questions or comments from my friends over here?
I think we're going to get into this, how you work when you start working with families, students, parents, how you work with the student, how you would work with the
Sure.
family.
So, a lot of times people come to me at the start of their senior year, and, we can do a lot in the 180 days of senior year. But if you start thinking about when the applications are due, November 1st is the first deadline for college applications. So for those of you listening, perhaps waiting until senior year might not give you or your student enough time to really get all of the work done. I do some work with students as young as freshman year. I really work in earnest with kids by the end of their junior year, because that's really when the college planning should begin. And we can talk about a specific deadline in a little while, but yes, if you've got freshmen, you've got stuff to do. If you've got seniors, you can still get everything done. It's just a little more stressful and a little more intense. So for students who are on an IEP, they are pretty much getting tested every 3 years. And it's really important to be mindful of the time frame and updated testing before your student goes to college. So why do updated testing when they're in high school? There are a couple of reasons. One is that testing is helpful for accommodations on standardized tests. That updated testing is also important because colleges, for accommodation reasons, they're looking for specific tests that are usually done when a student is over the age of 16. So most of you, if you've had your student have any cognitive testing, they've done the WISC, near and dear to everyone's heart. When they turn 16, that should shift over to the WACE, and that's one of the tests that colleges require as you start to seek accommodations. So the testing is important both for standardized test accommodations, for college testing, for college accommodations rather, and also for some of the schools that offer comprehensive programs or specialized programs, that updated testing is going to be important. So in terms of when to test, there are a couple of times that make sense. If your student's younger and going into high school, having updated testing around 8th or 9th grade is helpful, especially if you're looking at any independent schools that require the SSATs. The next set of testing most usually is done junior year so that you can take advantage of them turning 16 and getting the WACE done so that that testing is updated. And then in terms of what to test, it really varies based on your student's profile, but I think usually you want updated cognitive testing, you want updated academic testing, and any other testing that's related to your student's disability. So if your student has a physical disability, you want to have somebody be looking at what their current abilities are and what their needs are moving forward. If they've got a learning difference, you want to really drill down into those reading, writing, and expressive skills. And so there are specific tests for different disabilities, and I'm happy to answer that sort of question if you want to reach out to me. In terms of who should be doing the testing, schools certainly are welcome to do their level of testing, but in order to get an updated diagnosis, you probably need to work with a neuropsychologist or a neurologist based on your student's disability. And you want to make sure that they're giving you a diagnosis that's correlated to the DSM codes, and also that the report includes not only the diagnosis but also recommendations, because that's really what your student is going to use when they go off to college and seek accommodations. Any questions about the updated testing? And this is just a reminder, you need their diagnosis for college planning, accommodations, and acceptance into the specialized programs. So before we move on, any questions about the testing? Yes?
Yes. So the schools generally test every 3 years, but can a student be tested more often, for example?
Sure. So you have the right as a parent to request testing by the school every year in any area of suspected disability.
Okay.
So you take advantage of that right and use that in here. For a lot of students, you could also start discussing this as part of their transition planning. So in 9th grade and 10th grade, you can be very clear with the team that you're looking for updated testing when they turn 16 so that you can do the WACE. And usually schools are accommodating, but if they're not, I'm happy to answer specific questions. But yes, ideally junior year is that year that you want to be able to do as much testing as possible. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. This is usually the part in the presentation where parents are either like, oh, I'm feeling so much better, my student really seems to be on board and is ready to go and figure out, let's move on. And there are others that are sort of getting stressed at this point. So whether you're feeling really confident or a little concerned about your student's readiness, the answer is not to hover and micromanage. The answer is really to take an accurate assessment of where your student is and what they need for support moving forward, and help them start to own this, not continue to do everything for them. We can move on. So when we start to get into the college search process, when I work with families, I try and make it really clear that a lot of the work for a student with special needs is based around their special needs. But a student is so much more than just what their disability is, that it's really important to have the conversation about college not only be about their supports, but also about their interests and their preferences. So it's really important to have those conversations with students and get a sense of what they're thinking. And again, it's not what mom and dad are thinking, it's what the student is really thinking in terms of their interests, their career goals, their plans for an intended major, their sense of what sort of setting they want to be in. Are they students who would do well in a pressure cooker setting, or are they students that would do better in a more laid back environment? Do they want to be in a city? Do they want to be, in a college town? Do they want to be in the middle of nowhere? What size school seems like it's manageable? And it's really hard for a lot of students, especially kids with special needs, but for any student, to make those sort of conversations around the dinner table. They have no sense of, what a school with 40,000 students looks like. They have no sense of what a classroom with 500 students looks like. So getting them onto campuses is going to be really important to give them a sense of what feels right for them. And what feels right for one student is not going to be the same for what feels right for the student sitting next to them. So it's really important to do all of these traditional college planning conversations with a student with special needs, just like you would for a neurotypical student, even if there's going to be more factors that we need to consider for the student with special needs. So we're going to spend some time now talking about what the right level of support is for a student that's looking at colleges, and we can move on to the next slide. So there are 4 types of supports that colleges offer, and it's important for you as a parent and your student to understand what they are and what they look like when they're looking at schools. So there are schools that offer academic support and tutoring. There are schools that offer accommodations. There are schools that offer comprehensive programs, and there are specialized colleges for students with specific disabilities. And we're going to go through and talk about each of these next. So this is just another way to think about the types of supports. The blue area indicates the number of schools that offer that sort of accommodation. So as you can look, all schools offer academic support and tutoring. All schools offer accommodations. Some schools have comprehensive programs, and a very small number of schools are specialized colleges for students with special needs. And we're going to look at these each in detail. So every college provides things like a math and writing center, study skills, time management skills, and tutoring. And these are some of the least utilized programs on college campuses. These are available for every student, whether they have a disability or not. And they are wonderful resources for every student. And it's really important for students with special needs to view these as available for them as well. They vary greatly from school to school. So when you are scheduling your visits to schools, it's really important for you to not only visit and go on the tour, but also spend some time in the disability services, working with the academic support center and getting a sense of what they offer. Some schools offer student tutoring, some schools offer grad school tutoring, some schools offer professional tutoring, and the range of those services will vary greatly. So get a sense of what your student needs, and when you're on campus, really get a sense of what the school offers specifically. And we can move on to the next. So for a lot of students with special needs, just those general ed supports that we just talked about are really not going to be enough support for what they need. So it's important also to get a sense of how a school handles accommodations. Simple standard accommodations include extra time on tests, notes of peers, audio books, early registration for class, or reduced course load. One of the important things about accommodations in college is no accommodation is going to change the basic expectations for a course. So if your student is taking a 400 level history course, they're expected to do 400 level history coursework and submit, all of the assignments and do all of the work and understand all of the content. So it's really important to understand that big change from high school. We're not talking modifications to the course content or the expectations. So these are the sort of accommodations that are available, and most students who have a 504 or an IEP in high school should really be prepared to request accommodations in college. And we can move on. So to get accommodations in college, and again, this is all student-driven, this is not mom and dad-driven, they're going to need to register with the Disability Services Center on campus. They need to submit the paperwork that explains their disability, and they need to identify what accommodations they're going to need. And then the communication with professors varies. Sometimes the Disability Services Center sends the note to the professors. Sometimes the note gets sent to the student, and they need to then share it with the professor. At no point does that communication ever identify the student's disability, so that is confidential and entirely up for the student to decide if they want to disclose to professors or not. So all the letter says is basically, Johnny Q has been identified as a student who requires the following accommodations. So their professor doesn't need to know what their disability is, just that they're getting specific accommodations. And then in some cases, professors are great and will be able to easily work with you and honor the accommodations, and some professors are not so great at honoring those accommodations. So again, this is a place where those self-advocacy skills become really important, because it's going to be the difference between fighting for their access to the accommodations or suffering in silence and having it reflected in their grades. So we're going to move on. For some students, even just getting accommodations is really not going to be enough to support their needs. So a growing number of schools are offering programs for specific types of learning styles or disabilities. They typically require a separate application. They typically have their own fee-based structure, so you have to pay extra for them. They're staffed separately from the academic support or the disability office, and the programs really vary widely from college to college. And in your handout, I've listed some options for different types of disabilities, so you can use those as a stepping stone if you're looking for comprehensive program support. And we can move on to specialized colleges. So this is a really very small market, but a very intriguing option for students who even in a comprehensive program would not have their needs met. So it's an entire course program and campus designed around a specific type of disability. So diagnosis, again, an updated diagnosis is necessary for admission. Some examples include Landmark College in Vermont, which is designed for students with learning differences and people on the spectrum. Beacon College in Florida is designed for students with learning differences. The National Technical Institute for the Deaf in New York is designed for people with hearing difficulties, and Gallaudet University in DC is also for students with hearing difficulties. Any questions around the specialized colleges or those 4 levels of support that we talked about? So it's really important at this point to start thinking about where is your student's needs going to fall in those 4 sort of categories. Are they a student that is going to need, the general supports and tutoring? Are they going to need accommodations? Are you going to be looking at schools with comprehensive programs, or are you going to be focusing your search on these specialized colleges? And knowing that early in the process is really going to help your college search become much easier and streamlined for you and your student.
I do have a question.
Sure.
So, in your experience, this is a very broad question, but in your experience, how are the guidance departments prepared to help with some of these specialized colleges and special programs?
They often are not. This is really outside of most guidance counselors' knowledge. And I think a lot of them, if you give them the information, they are more than happy to work with you. But I think most guidance counselors don't have a lot of training in guidance counseling for students with special needs and really being able to match a student's learning profile with a specific area of need. So, I don't think they're always trained and able to go in and say, okay, Sarah, here's your testing, and this is really what I think you need. It's a comprehensive program, and then to be able to say, these are the comprehensive programs that I think would meet your needs. I think a lot of guidance counselors would be more than happy to try to do that. So it's not a question of willingness, it's just not necessarily what their training is prepared them for. Yeah. Yep.
And are there other things that parents should be aware of? For example, I heard from a parent that they didn't realize that UMass Amherst had a certain grade point requirement. So are there other kind of little flags and things like that maybe that parents should be aware of and early on, like sophomore, junior?
So the question was, are there specific things about certain colleges that parents need to know about, such as a grade point average requirement? And the answer is yes. And part of that is doing your college research. So, when I sit down with a student and I do a whole inventory of what their interests are, I use all of that to then come up with a list of schools. And the next thing I do is I share the list with the student, and then I expect them and their parents to do research around those schools. So, that involves not just visiting the website, but really starting to look at, the academic program that they're interested in, the admissions requirements, so that all of that becomes identified before they even start applying to schools. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So we can move on from here. So we've talked a little bit about, understanding what your students' needs are, getting updated testing, figuring out what sort of supports they need, and at some point we start to need to translate that into what colleges are your student actually going to be applying to. So we're going to be spending some time talking about the application process now and starting with the basics. So we can move on to the next slide. So researching the schools for a student with special needs is really important because there are so many factors that go into finding the right school. It's not just, does the school have the major that they're looking at? It's really a lot of multifaceted, very unique to the student sorts of considerations that go into defining and identifying what a good fit school is going to be. And it's really important to plan and get ready for college visits. For some students with anxiety, the thought of going onto a college campus can be really intimidating. And I've had students who have, set up the visits in advance, gone to the campus, took one look around and said, I'm not getting out of the car. So really doing a lot of planning beforehand to help them get comfortable with this, and maybe even starting visiting schools before their junior or senior year so that there's that fear factor has been eliminated or managed so that they sort of know that it's not scary and they know what to expect. So do a couple of practice school visits even as a freshman. There are 4,000 colleges in the US, give or take. So chances are when you go on a vacation almost anywhere, there's going to be a college campus nearby. Stop and schedule a visit or a tour while you're there, doing something fun like on vacation. So doing a lot of the planning up front and starting it early is really important. Taking tours and seeing what the campus is like is also going to be really important. You can get a lot from a school's website, but all the pictures are sunny, all the kids are happy, and you don't really get a sense of the vibe of the specific school. So it's important to visit as many of the schools as you can. And while you're on campus, you want to make sure that you're meeting with a disability office, meeting with a student success center, having conversations about the types of programming or supports that you think your student needs. If you know that they're a horrible writer and they're going to need to spend a lot of time in the writing center, visit it, make a plan in advance to see if you can sit down with the people who run it to get a sense of what those supports actually look like. I try and as unobtrusively as possible suggest that you bring a notebook for your student, for yourself, so you can jot things down and keep track of what you think. So the visits and getting on campus are really important. And then talk with your student and evaluate where you've been and what you've seen and what you think. It has to be your student's decision about where they feel comfortable. And some of that's going to be fact-based, and some of it really is just based on intangibles. And it's really important to be flexible because chances are of those 4,000 schools, you can easily find, 20 to apply to, but only if you're not so rigid that they all have to have exactly the same thing because every school is different. So those are some of the basics in terms of which schools to apply to, and we can move on to the next slide to talk about how many colleges. So in general, we want to apply to 8 to 10 schools or so. The number and that depends on everything that we've already talked about, but it's really important to only apply to schools that your student is actually interested in going to. And you want to sort of look at the student's sort of record and profile and find schools that are a good range of schools that are highly likely to get into, schools that are targeted with their skill sets, and schools that might be a reach but would offer additional great programs or options for them. So you want to have a range of schools within those three categories of low, medium, and high likelihood of acceptance. And we can move on. So in terms of getting through the application, if your school uses any sort of planning tool like Naviance, make sure that you and your student get comfortable and familiar with it soon. Many schools use the Common App, so again, get started and get familiarize yourself with that. The great thing about the Common App is it makes it really easy to apply to schools. The downside of the Common App is it's really changed the way students have to think about applying, and where we had to do it all by hand, so you were pretty selective in going through and applying to certain schools only if you really wanted to go. It's so easy now just to click a button and submit that a lot of people schools get a lot more applicants than what are really interested in going. So there's a sort of duality there of the convenience of the Common App. Understand each college admissions deadlines. So you build out a whole calendar of, what are the schools you're applying to, what are the deadlines, what are the requirements. Some schools have just the essay from the Common App, others have short writing samples that they require. So it's a lot of logistics. Think of yourself as an air traffic controller and help your student really do a lot of that work as well. Make sure that you stick to the calendar and make sure that you meet all the deadlines. Schools typically offer 3 different application options. Early decision is obviously you apply early, usually the 1st of November or sometime in November. And those decisions are binding. So basically when you apply to a school early decision, you're agreeing to rescind all of the other applications and go to that school regardless of financial aid awards. So that is a binding decision, and you have a very hard time getting out of that. So if your student is dead set on one school, and if your finances are such that applying to that school and funding it are easy for you, absolutely early decision makes a lot of sense. But if those factors are not describing your family, it's important to not get into a situation with early decision. Another option is early action. It has a similar deadline, usually November 1st or sometime in November, but those are not binding. So you get an opportunity to be considered in a smaller pool of applicants. You get a decision earlier in the application process, and you're not obligated to make a decision until the regular decisions in May. Other schools have regular decision, which is you're just in the large pool of applicants, and you hear usually in the spring about your acceptance, and you need to make a decision after that. So really start looking at that strategically. There are advantages to doing early decision or early action versus regular decision, and sometimes that's based on I really want to go to this school, so I want to be considered in that small school. And sometimes it's, I can't handle the stress of doing these applications in November, so we're going to do regular decision to manage the student stress. So that's sort of a really quick down and dirty of the basics of the application, and we can move on to the next slide. So the application deadline is usually sometime between November and January. I recommend that all families, even if you don't think you need or qualify for financial aid, to apply for the financial aid in January or February. Some schools use the FAFSA, some schools use the CSS profile. They're very similar, they ask for a lot of information, but it's worthwhile because the FAFSA gives you access to guaranteed student loans, so even if you don't qualify for anything else, you're at least getting those student loans available. For students that are going through regular decision, you're usually going to hear back from the school in March and April. If your student is accepted, they get accepted and you get information about the financial package right then. Some schools will also, inform your student that they've been rejected, and others will put your student on a wait list. And for students who are waitlisted, it's a very individualized decision. Do you have that dream school that you're waitlisted on and you are going to wait to hear back on whether or not you get in? Or are you okay that, your dream school may not have accepted you, but you found other schools that are just as good fits and you're going to make a decision based on where you actually did get in? The student commitment with a deposit is due May 1st. Most schools have some sort of campus orientation over the summer. And then the first semester bill comes in June or July, and school starts August or September. For schools that have special programs, they sometimes have early move-in dates for students to get settled. For students with any sort of physical limitation, there are often options to get onto campus early so that you can start navigating finding those curb cuts and navigating how to get around campus. So for students with special needs, there are other things to consider in addition to just this general application timeline. But we can move on from here for now. So a little bit about standardized tests and students with special needs. Both the SAT and the ACT offer practice tests online. They're offered without accommodations, so you just sit and your student can take them without accommodations, but it gives them a sense of what each test is like. And that's really helpful because some students tend to prefer one test over another. So knowing early on which your student prefers or does better in is really helpful, because then you can target your test taking around one specific test. It's really hard for a lot of students to manage, Saturday I'm taking the SAT, next month I'm taking the ACT, and flip-flopping back and forth. So as much as possible, I try and strongly suggest that students stick with one test and just focus on that. If you're interested in private tutoring around test prep, those are certainly an option. For a lot of students with special needs, they don't do well on standardized tests, even with all the tutoring and test taking supports available. So it's really important to also think about test optional schools. There are over 800 schools in the US right now that are test optional. There are sort of two ways to think about test optional schools. One is that they give students the option to not disclose their test scores, so that the test scores that they do report to the to the student search and ranking profiles has a higher SAT score or ACT score than they would if they took those kids who had lower scores if they disclosed them. The other thing is that a lot of schools are starting to realize that standardized test scores do not indicate student success like they were thought to, and so they don't really think that that's an appropriate indicator of a student's profile. If your student just really doesn't do well or doesn't want to take standardized tests, definitely check out the test optional schools. And they range from very competitive schools to not as competitive schools. So if you're looking at some of those more competitive schools, just understand that if you don't provide a standardized test, everything else within your student's application really needs to accurately match the profile of student for that school. So a school with a 9% acceptance rate that happens to be test optional, you still have to be part of that 9% acceptance and have those solid scores and have those solid courses to be a viable candidate for that school. And we can move on from here. So another thing to consider is, when is it appropriate for your student to disclose their disability? You do not need to walk on campus and announce at every admissions office that your student has a disability. You can certainly choose to disclose during the application. If there's anything in your student's records that would give an admissions officer pause or concern, it's probably worth explaining and disclosing in the application. It doesn't have to be their essay. It can be a short, simple sentence or two in the additional information part of the application, just explaining, my standardized test scores are low because I have a disability of X, Y, and Z, and my working memory, just makes it really hard for me to demonstrate what I know on standardized tests, but I think my grades accurately reflect, my academic potential much better. For some students that don't have any of those blips in their application, and there's nothing that would give an admissions officer pause, then you may not need to disclose in your application. You can wait and do it after you've decided where you go to school. It's really important, though, to not wait until you're on campus to do the accommodation application, because it takes a couple of weeks for them to review all of your documentation, form the letter, and distribute it out to professors. And if a student waits until they get to campus to do that couple of week delay might actually mean that they have tests and quizzes during that time, and the professors are under no obligation to retroactively fit accommodations into those test scores. So definitely do it once they've decided where they're going to school in the start of the spring and summer. And never is just silly. I do work with kids who are really tired of carrying around any sort of label and want to go off to college and just be their own and do their own. But I think it's really important for them to understand why they're getting accommodations and why they're important to their success. And they're designed to level the playing field, not to give your student an advantage, but there's absolutely no reason for your student to have a disadvantage against their peers in a class where they could be doing well with extra time or with some extra supports. So sometimes disclose when you're applying. Definitely apply right after you've been accepted so that you know where you're going and you have all the accommodations in place once you've stepped on campus. We can move on. So for some students with special needs, the interview process is a great opportunity for them to be more than what they are on paper. And I think that for some students that's really important. Schools sometimes have interviews, sometimes they don't. If they do offer interviews, there are two types. There are informative and evaluative. The informative interviews are really just for your student to get a good sense of that school. So typically they would meet with an admissions representative or an alumni and be able to ask questions about the school. Sometimes those informative interview assessments are written down and documented and added into the student's file, but sometimes they're not. They're just sort of a nice meet and greet. Some colleges offer interviews and they're evaluative, which means that the purpose of the interview is not just for the student to ask questions about the school, but it's really an opportunity for the school to evaluate the student as a potential candidate. And those evaluative interview results go into the student's records and are part of their application process. So again, sort of knowing if your student is a great interviewer or not, and knowing what the specific schools that they're interested in applying to offer for interviews is important. So just make that becomes part of the planning process as well. And we can move on from the interviews. For students with any sort of special talents or that are applying to colleges and submitting any body of work, you know, artists or musicians or designers or video production, it's a great opportunity for them to spend some time building a portfolio so that they can have that included into their application as well. Athletic recruiting is a whole nother webinar that I'm happy to talk about at a later date. But if you have a student athlete who's interested in competing in college, it's really important to understand that that process starts earlier. The NCAA, especially for Division I, just changed their timelines. So that is a whole separate process in addition to the college process that is important to understand and manage well. So just know that that's a whole nother timeline, and our goal is to give our students an opportunity to really have that full-bodied college experience that they're looking for as they showcase their skills. And we can move on. The essays. The Common App, if most schools are on the Common App, and they have set questions that get released in the summer before senior year, and I tell students to ignore the prompts. I don't want the student to try and answer a prompt. I want them to tell a story that only they can tell. And that could be about their disability, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be a story that's unique to them. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I worked with a student who spent summers as a lifeguard, and they were a cross-country runner, and they were running a race, and somebody from another team collapsed in the middle of the woods, and the student decided to stay and use her first aid training to, help this student, and thankfully the student was fine. But that was the essay. I've had other students talk about how their friend's suicide impacted their decision to major in a specific field, and how they plan to honor their friend's memory with that sort of decision. I've had students talk about a family vacation. So the what is far less important than the how you say it, and make sure that it's coming directly from you. Some general guidelines: don't use cliches, don't use platitudes, keep it within the time limit, but really start with a story that resonates with the student, not just focused on the prompts. And we can move on from the essays. So just some basic summaries. There's a lot in this process, and it's really important to start early and to make it as fun as possible and as stress-free as possible for your student. So ideally, yes, you want to start this process before senior year starts. You want to try and make this as student-driven as possible. This is not going to be fun or rewarding or really effective if you're the one making all the choices and you're doing all the application work. And again, it's supposed to be fun. You're going to miss your student when they're gone, hopefully. So try and make the time that you have with them as they're getting ready for college as fun as possible. Go to campus, do the tour, but sit and have a coffee afterwards and regroup and watch the world go by, and just enjoy being with your child as much as possible. And we can take it from here. As your student gets ready to get onto campus, I just want to re-emphasize some of the important things that are going to make it easy for them to adjust to college. Make sure that they have those strong self-advocacy skills and they're motivated to be on campus and do well. Have them be ready to take advantage of the supports that are available on campus, both those, gen ed accommodations and supports, but also anything that's available within their comprehensive program or specialized program. And certainly if they're struggling, they need to be able to self-advocate and ask for help from you, but also from the people on campus that can help them. So what does this all mean? Just again, some quick reminders. you have to help your student be ready to self-advocate and to be independent and to be able to manage this on their own. And you need to help your student find the school or program or setting that's going to be right for them so that they can do those things effectively. I work with a lot of students getting ready to go to school, but I also work with a lot of students who have gone to school and it hasn't been at the right place, and it's been, they've sort of crashed and burned, and they have to regroup and be more mindful of where to go. We want to set our kids up for success. We don't want them to have a horrible first experience in college. So doing all of this work up front is really going to be helpful to make sure that they can be successful wherever they go. And we can move on. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to get them into school and to love it and to graduate close to on time as possible and really feel that success of getting a college degree. And we can skip forward. So, for a lot of students and parents, it's really scary to be thinking about them taking ownership of all of this, and for them, really to feel like their student is ready. And it's really okay if your kid is not ready for college. There are plenty of options right now for students if they're not ready to jump into a full 4-year program. I work with students who are looking at postgraduate years. I work with students who are looking at gap years that have nothing to do with schooling. And there are certainly 2-year colleges and other options for students. And I think rather than forcing all kids to go to a 4-year college, finding the right next step for them is really important. And I think that's where parents can do an important job setting the tone so that the student doesn't feel pressured to go to a 4-year school if that's not right for them. So when to get started? Now is good. If you have a student who's a freshman, there are things that you can be doing to get ready. You can work with them to visit a couple of colleges, to start talking with the team about accommodations on the PSATs. You can start thinking about majors and interests and potential jobs. And as a sophomore, you can start doing all of that as well, but really starting to look strategically at where they're going with their class selection in high school. And certainly junior year, it's really a good time to be looking at specific schools. By then, hopefully they have a sense of what they might want to study. And even if they're completely undecided, they have a sense of, what interests them. And I've had students work with me that have, said the biggest criteria that I'm looking for is a school with great school spirit, because I want to go someplace where I know I'm going to have fun on the weekends and people, are going to be doing things that are really fun and exciting, and I want that energy on my campus. And I've had kids who say, I want to study classics, and it has to have a competitive classics program, and I don't care about anything else as long as I can just lose myself in my major and spend my time doing that. So again, every student is individual, and it's really important to have their interests drive this process and to start as soon as possible. And we can move on. If you have questions at this point, here's my contact information. I'm happy to talk with you or to trade emails with you, and my goal is really to help you get through this process as easily and as in a fun a way as possible, and also that you feel confident that your student's going to be going someplace that's going to meet their needs. So feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have. There are some other slides toward the end, but we can leave it here, and I'm going to open up to other questions as well.
So my question would be, when should we, if we wanted to work with a consultant or a college coach, you start that spring of junior year?
Ideally, spring of junior year, yep.
And then how much time commitment should a student kind of be planning to make kind of spring of junior year through the application process?
So the question was, when should a student start working on their college stuff, and how much time commitment is it? Generally, spring of junior year is a good time to get started. Certainly you can start introducing some of the ideas around college before then, but really the goal is to have a list of schools by the end of junior year, or at least early summer before senior year, identified so that they can start working on the Common App over the summer, working on their essays over the summer. For some of the schools, they have their own separate small essays, and some of them can have as many as 5 small essays. So again, spending that summer before senior year, getting that work done just makes senior year that much easier. And in terms of time commitment, I'd say 1 to 2 hours a week from that spring over the summer for the student to really work on the essays, getting the Common App done, doing their research on schools. that would be a reasonable amount of time. And the sooner you start it, the more easy the schedule is, because you're not doing 10 hours a week in addition to your senior classes. Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for joining us. It was nice to talk with you.